Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and I'm here at CircleDC in Washington, D.C. with Yoni Goldstein, who's going to talk to us about a couple of games that he's working on. Could you introduce your games for us, Yoni?
Of course. Well, thank you so much for having me. My first design is Chicago 68. It's an asymmetric historical strategy game covering the Democratic National Convention riots in 1968 in Chicago, of course. I also have with me the Knights of King Lud, which is about the Luddite revolts at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. It's a cooperative game of industrial sabotage. This one's still in development, so I'm happy to talk about Chicago 68.
Yes, can you talk a little bit about the gameplay?
Sure. So Chicago 68, like I mentioned, is an asymmetric game. It's essentially a confrontation of two sides, two very sort of different ideological poles. You have the establishment on one side, which is composed of the Chicago Police Department and the city administration and party bosses. And on the other side, you have the demonstrators, which is the Youth International Party, the Yippies, and the National Mobilization and the War in Vietnam. So this is a collection of anti-war and civil rights activists who came into very violent confrontation in the city of Chicago at the Democratic National Convention, where eventually Hubert Humphrey is nominated to be the presidential candidate against Richard Nixon.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And if you're playing four factions, how do those factions break out?
Yeah, so that's actually something that's unique about the game. So in a two-player mode, you're handed two decks. One deck is going to be your leadership deck, and the other deck is your rank and file deck.
Okay.
And so you're positioning yourself, whether it's in the political dimension or whether it's through street clashes and radical, street theater and that kind of like, all sorts of kind of like mischief that the demonstrators are doing on the street, right? So in a two-player game, you're playing from both decks. In a four-player game, you have a 2v2 kind of situation where you split the decks between factions, and then you introduce variable turn order to create a much more sort of dynamic, chaotic, and kinetic situation that you're dealing with. And then in the solo mode, you're playing against the establishment as the demonstrators, which also allows for a cooperative game. So if you don't feel comfortable cracking skulls as the Chicago police, you can be the demonstrators and work with another player to, against what we call the machine, which is our sort of automa bot.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Very good. Great. And what kind of gamer do you think will like this game?
I hope that it has like a pretty broad appeal. It's interesting because I've played it with both, non-gamers or gamers who are used to non-historical games, but I've also played this with wargamers. So there are definitely like baked-in systems that would be very familiar to a wargamer, like area of control and different sort of like deployment and recruiting and things like that. I find with like non-history gamers. I often ask them to maybe there's no like official sort of role playing in it, but sort of like embody the faction that you're playing and sort of like imagine what you would be doing, and you find yourself in certain corners where you're forced to do maybe an awful thing, and you see sort of like the stress that players are going to go through and anxiety they have about doing something, but like understanding why they are in a position where they have to do that. And that's like a very interesting thing for non-wargamers. But wargamers sort of are people who are engaging in like, in the strategy and sort of like historical narrative and the arc that the game develops. And they've been really enjoying the game, and I hope that it sort of like appeals to like both audiences.
Right.
Yeah.
I would think also too there's a potential there for the older gamers that lived through that time.
Absolutely.
To kind of reach back, because I think there's a lot of memories that sit back in
Yeah,
that time.
yeah.
So it was a turbulent era in U.S. history, for sure.
Yeah. And the game, it's a sort of mid-level sort of complexity game. So, it is approachable for for people who are just interested in the topic, as long as you have somebody that you're playing with who's like maybe a little bit more familiar with the way like these kind of games work, it's hopefully it's something that like has like a broader appeal.
Right, for sure. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, is there one scenario in the game and you're playing that set game, or are there other scenarios or options for gameplay too?
So there are definitely options. One of the things that one of the sort of like the theses of the game is that the kind of shape that political reality takes depends a lot on the conditions in which it's created.
Okay.
So that means that there are certain sort of set conditions that every game starts with, but then there's additional variables that are going to change every game, which are going to produce radically different results.
Okay.
So it's a very open-ended game, even though, interestingly, it's just focusing on 3 days of convention week.
Oh, okay, so the whole game length is 3 historical days.
3 days, okay. August 26th to 28th, but those days are very decisive, and the game sort of explores that. Now, on top of that, I've also included a couple of sort of advanced scenarios that I call incendiary events.
Okay.
And these allow you to sort of bend the arc of history a little bit more. It's a little bit more by introducing just like I limited myself to 4 sort of postcard-sized rule books, little mini rules. That you add to the game once you're familiar with the base game. And this allows you to do 2 things. One, you can, let's say if you're playing with a less experienced player, you can introduce more challenges for yourself. And the other is that, if both players sort of experience, you can include all 4 incendiary events together and create a very challenging, interesting, even more chaotic game, because ultimately sort of what's being modeled here is a riot.
Right.
A riot that was, according to government reports, included both the police and the demonstrators. Both sides sort of lost, command and control.
Right.
And so what happens is going to be very unpredictable.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
And then in terms of kind of that connects to the next idea, which is depth and replayability.
Yeah.
Just because each of it's an asymmetric game, it's going to play very differently depending on which side you take.
Yeah.
And then you're talking about the combination of all these scenarios too would add to that as well, right?
Yeah. So, it's interesting, right? We see like sort of consistent results, but in the way the game sort of like progresses, and it has very interesting arcs. But even as a designer, I'm constantly seeing like new iterations and new things happening that I've never seen before. But the system is robust enough to handle that.
Right.
And I haven't mentioned it. It's also, we say it's like 45 minutes per player.
Okay.
So in the sort of like base like 2-player game, you're looking at a 90-minute game.
Okay.
So it's enough time that you can play a game, switch sides, play another game,
right.
And you have like a good day of gaming.
Fantastic. And you mentioned too that the game itself is a 3-day span. Is each turn a set number of hours then? Is that how the game flows, or
Not
is it
exactly.
a little bit more ambiguous?
Not exactly. I'm sure you can break it down that way if you're really intent on it.
Right.
But the way it works is that it plays over 5 rounds.
Okay.
Each round is half a day. So you have day and night, and then the last round is just like a quick sort of like, there's a 6 sort of cleanup round where we have an election, and there's a presidential nominee, whether it's Hubert Humphrey or Eugene McCarthy.
Okay.
Those are sort of like the 2 sort of results. And that actually feeds into the event system, which is connected to what I call mob chaos. Mob chaos is something that happens if too many units are engaged in conflict.
Okay.
Or other sort of like little things might trigger it. But because the game conflict in the game is very deterministic. A more powerful force could defeat a weaker force. It's fine,
Right.
But once too many people are involved, there's going to be an unpredictable result, and that result is going to also be determined by whether or not it's a day or night time event.
Makes sense.
Which connects to the current round that you're in.
Got it.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, great. Could you talk just a little bit about what's in the box, like what kind of components and things like that?
So right now this is just a prototype box, not final artwork. but you're looking at a like a 6-fold board. You're looking at wooden components, some like shaped components as well. For you have like agitators on one side. You have the tactical force on the police side, and so like wooden components. Lots of like little tokens, lots of like little like and then the main sort of like action selection system is through card play.
Right.
So you're going to have a hand of cards that each person gets.
Fantastic.
So that's your typical
game. Yes.
Game components. Yeah.
For sure. Yep. You mentioned it a little bit in terms of the solo bot, and so it's definitely a lot of solitaire viewers that watch the channel, and really that's one of the deciding factors. And how's that going in terms of working on that solo system for them?
It's I'm really proud of the solo system. It's very interesting because, like I mentioned, in the solo mode you're playing as the demonstrators, and what you're doing is that as you're playing, you're placing active tokens on the areas in which you're in which you're activating cards as well. And so what that does is that it creates an organic and dynamic priority system for the bot.
Okay.
So if you're on one side of the city and you're making a lot of noise, the police force is going to move towards you. Right. And you can be clever and you can try to sort of like split those forces by being in different areas and like activating different priorities for them. So that's it's a really nice system. It plugs into the existing system pretty well.
Right.
And so you're only adding 2 pages of rules to the rule book. So
fantastic. And I think a lot of times what people want to hear is sometimes solitaire systems are thought of as kind of like an add-on, but it seems like there's a lot of focus on this too in terms of people are going to be comfortable as a solitaire player. They're going to get a great experience.
And like I said, you can combine the solitaire system with the variable turn order, and then you could split the demonstrators into 2 players, and then you're playing cooperatively.
Right.
Which I think I'm very interested in the way that war games lately have been more interested in cooperative play.
Yes.
And as we're seeing today at the conference, a lot of co-op games are out there because it's a very fertile space now for war games, because war games have been historically so competitive.
Yes.
That I know people are hesitant to play cooperatively, but I think there's a lot of new design ideas there.
Yeah, and it's also, especially if you're playing with people you don't know that well, it's really nice to come in and say, hey, let's play together. There's rather that competitive element. So fantastic. So I realize it's got a ways to go, but could you talk a little bit about the progression? When can people expect to possibly have this on their tables and be enjoying it?
Sure. All right. So the design, I would say, is 99% complete. So right now we're just doing final artwork, and that's going to take a few months, of course. Like, I'm very keen on it being like, very kind of like artistically well produced.
Right.
The Kickstarter is going to start in late July. We'll have a kickoff event in Chicago because this year the Democratic National Convention will be in Chicago once again.
You couldn't ask for a better situation, right?
So and that will be in August. So Kickstarter will start in late July and end in late August. And then as soon as the artwork is finished, we'll get it out there.
Okay, so probably sometime early 2025, late 2024, perhaps?
I think so, yeah.
So I realize it's hard to say.
I don't know, I'm not the publisher, but all I can say is by the time the Kickstarter launches, the design is complete. We'll have a new, we're redesigning visually the board.
Right.
But then it's just artwork on the cards, and
fantastic.
There we go.
Yeah, great. Yeah. So Kickstarter in July.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's being published through the Dietz Foundation.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for watching.